I'm Jason Cannon, and this is The Inner Life of Liberalism, a podcast about the practices that help us live well and flourish together. Today, my co-host Aaron Ross Powell and I are joined by Christina Bambrick of the University of Notre Dame to discuss her recent book, Constitutionalizing the Private Sphere. We talk with Christina about virtue, constitutional design, and how the two interact in America and abroad. Patrons of the show can listen to an extended version at liberalpractice.org. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Christina, you have long been interested in the resources that liberalism has to go beyond the traditional rights and institutions talk that so much conversation centers on in liberal democracies. And you recently wrote an article that was titled "The Promise of Virtue, Old and New." So I thought we might start there, if that's all right.
Sure, absolutely.
What is the promise of virtue today? Why does liberalism need to recover its connection to virtue?
Yeah, well, this article actually began in a graduate seminar I took on virtue, more from like a Thomistic perspective. And it occurred to me in the course of this seminar that a lot of the dissatisfaction, what dissatisfaction exists, both I think from the political right and the political left with respect to liberalism, often kind of circles around certain versions of liberalism and what people perceive as, I think, a kind of inadequate approach to moral questions. So the article talks about, kind of the neo-integralist movement from the political right and a more kind of progressive, anti-racist perspective from the left. And what I found really interesting was from both, these seemingly opposite political sides, there's common language about common criticism about what they perceive as, liberal neutrality and a kind of hesitance to really take on some big moral questions. And, it hasn't always been that way. So one thing I wanted to bring out in the article was, liberalism is a big tent. So I think what these criticisms often focus on is what some take to be a kind of Rawlsian neutrality, which to put my cards on the table, I also take to be inadequate. I know you can read Rawls in different ways. Some think that an overemphasis on that neutrality isn't fair. That is how I read him. And so from that perspective, I think some of the criticisms are warranted, I guess. I consider myself a classical liberal, but I do think some of those criticisms are warranted. And I think they can be addressed, though, within the tradition of liberalism. I think if you go back to older versions, and I think both of you, or at least I think Jason, you focus on early modern thought, so you probably see where I'm going with this. They did talk about virtue, and they didn't use this kind of language of neutrality, or in other words, the core of those older versions of liberalism wasn't the same like autonomy and neutrality that you get from later versions. And so I think if we recognize liberalism as this big tent that can encompass this kind of moral language, it actually offers resources to address the contemporary critics and maybe even shore up liberalism amid, what some consider to be a kind of crisis moment, or at least a moment of, issues that liberals are confronting today.
One concern I think that can be raised about this, like, re-import virtue talk into liberalism is if virtue is about the kind of people that we are, it's stable traits of character and perspectives on the world and so on, and then writ large, it's about what kind of society we have. It's a vision of the good life and how we all live together and what that living together looks like in the aggregate. Then I agree with you on the liberal neutrality. I think liberal neutrality is ultimately untenable in like a robust sense. We really can't avoid kind of virtue talk and talk of good lives and good society and so on. But how do we avoid then falling into just liberalism becoming people fighting over like this macro view of the good life, that really what the political debates are about is, I think everyone should live this way and you think everyone should live that way. And then it becomes, from like a pluralistic standpoint, kind of untenable.
Yep. I think that's the question, right? That is exactly the question that gets to the heart of all of this. And my answer right now, I think it's twofold. I might be rambling on. It might become three and fourfold. I would say there's a difference between saying or operating on the presumption that there is one correct view of the good life that everyone needs to subscribe to, versus the view that I think is more tenable even within a liberal perspective, which would be to recognize the moral significance of politics and the fact that political questions cannot but bear on who we are. So it becomes a kind of just empirical question, or maybe being realistic about the implications of politics. And so it's not so much to mandate a vision of the good life as it is to recognize, look, what we're doing in politics actually bears on how people will go about their lives and their ability to pursue the good life. And so I think it requires some recognition that politics cannot but bear on our ability to be virtuous, if that makes sense, as opposed to thinking that we can easily separate these, or as opposed to kind of pretending that, okay, well, what we do in politics is separable from how people go about pursuing virtue or pursuing their projects. Does that make sense? So I don't know if that fully addresses your question, so feel free to push back. But the one other point I want to make is to say, I actually think that by admitting questions about virtue and, to some extent, morality in general, it actually gives leverage for liberals to demand limited government. So what I mean by that, and I make this point a little bit, I make it more fully in the article. If we are operating solely from a perspective that tries to take, for example, a kind of Rawlsian understanding of neutrality, take understandings of liberalism that keep autonomy as a kind of central core. What you get from that is a perspective of liberalism and trying to be self-sufficient. So you have liberal theorists like Stephen Nasido. He's one person that I discuss at length in the article. And to his credit, he actually does develop an understanding of liberal virtues. My problem with it is that it is virtue for liberalism. And so it's internal to liberalism, and there's no basis on which to critique the project of liberal virtues from that perspective. So what I'm getting at is, by opening up the conversation to resources whose reference points exist outside of liberalism, it actually offers resources to shore up the liberal project, but also to critique things within it that maybe aren't good, that aren't sufficient. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think there's a temptation. I mean, so what your answer gets at too is that these are challenging questions to work through, and they're challenging questions for liberalism to work through. And if we open it up to virtue talk, it doesn't get us to easy and neat, like deontic sets of rules or follow this procedure and you get to the right answer all the time, which I think is fine. And I think is actually like one of the important critiques of a lot of the way that liberals, like a liberal institutionalist, liberal neutrality approach often gets, is it's like, those are hard questions. Let's just kind of not talk
exactly
about them. And so the fact that there isn't an easy answer to these kinds of concerns is actually, I think, an argument that we need to dive into them more, versus say like, well, let's just stay up in kind of like original position thinking, or somewhere where we can like avoid that kind of messiness of just how we live together, and how society functions.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right.
It also seems like there's a move that liberals sometimes make, which is understandable for various reasons, but a move that wants to say something like the following: regardless of who you are or what your beliefs are, you can arrive at liberal commitments for XYZ sorts of reasons. So, Rawls gets in this direction when he starts talking about an overlapping consensus, right? But you really get it in the full Rawlsian apparatus of representative parties who are behind a veil of ignorance doing this process that, has multiple layers and sequences and all the rest. And the thing that makes virtue talk kind of a weird fit for that model is that this much older tradition of liberal thought was all about being the right kind of person for self-government, and the belief that like you had to have certain kinds of character traits in order for freedom to both be possible and durable, for any kind of polity. So
Absolutely.
is there a tension there? Do you see when you're sort of reflecting on the current lay of the liberal land, how do you think about this tension between, on the one hand, wanting to make liberalism a big enough tent, in your language, or a broad enough church such that anybody can come with any sets of views, and this tradition that says we want for there to be a broad range of views, and also liberal democracy requires certain things of us that just require us to be certain kinds of people? How do you navigate that tension in your own thought?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and I mentioned Stephen Macedo before, and there have been others, William Galston, several people in recent years have, begun to put their finger on exactly what you're saying, which is kind of an old insight. It's to say that, if we're a political community, if we're a polity of some kind, even a liberal polity is going to require a certain kind of citizen, certain virtues in order to make this project work, in order to live together. And I think, in general, an advantage of liberalism is that there's space for more kinds of people within that political community. If you compare liberal politics, liberal political community to, a Greek city-state, a Greek polis, it's going to be a broader, there will be a broader range of people who could fit within that. And that's, I think, good. And I think it's more or less, kind of conventional wisdom that we can take for granted today. That said, maybe that's an overstatement, but I'll leave it for now. That said, to live within liberal community, you still have to, buy into certain liberal commitments. And so that begins to mean different things, I think, depending on, the flavor of liberal that one is. And so to go back to my paper, you have some people trying to conceptualize certain liberal virtues, to really have a clear catalog, and again, to their credit, of the kinds of characteristics that would be good for liberal citizens. So one that I think is consistent throughout these accounts is toleration, which makes sense. I wonder, though, and this is where my own argument comes in, I wonder if there are certain virtues that are good for liberals that are also good for citizens elsewhere. And so you can, go back to, the cardinal virtues of ancient thought, courage, temperance, justice, prudence. Those seem to be good for everyone. And I think liberals can embrace those classical virtues too, and have their own spin-offs, their own versions of them, to good effect. And I think the ability to engage in those older conversations, as I said before, actually could give liberals leverage to speak across to other political traditions to people who maybe are disillusioned with certain aspects of liberalism today. So, and I guess what I'm getting at, to answer your question more directly, Jason, I think those old virtues can be just as ecumenical as, say, the liberal virtues. I think that they appeal very broadly. And so that is a way in which, for people who are interested in having conversations across, political traditions, that could be a bridge by which to do so.
I think this offers us a nice segue to your book, because virtues, one way of thinking about virtues, is that they are the kinds of things that we should inhabit as citizens, as humans, right? Just to make our lives go better, to make our collective lives go better. And as I read your book, the central question with the horizontality of constitutions, which is a big concept that I had no introduction to before I read the book. So I want for you to lay that out for us.
Sure, absolutely.
But the big question underlying it is essentially how much we can legally expect of others. And because we think about freedom in different ways, people will have different ways of answering that question. But this question of horizontality, I thought, did a really nice job of bringing to the surface questions that are kind of latent and things that we've all thought about and wondered about, but many of us have never really had the language to describe. So why don't we just start there? Tell us about what horizontality is, and then we'll make it a little bit more concrete as we go.
Great. Thank you. So my book is on this big question of horizontality, which sounds, it's jargon, right? But the concept's actually fairly simple. Typically, when we think of constitutional rights, the operating understanding is that they create obligations for the state. So if you have a right to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, it's the state that will have obligations with respect to protecting and respecting your freedom of expression. Or, there's a kind of more capacious understanding of rights in Europe, socioeconomic rights, let's say like a right to healthcare. Typically the understanding, if you have a right to healthcare, it's the government that will be responsible for protecting and promoting, respecting a right to healthcare. So more and more, we see courts and also constitution makers taking that traditional understanding of rights, and you can think about it as kind of having a vertical orientation. It's the government that's responsible for protecting the rights of citizens. So they're actually now moving the orientation horizontally, changing it to a horizontal orientation such that courts are using this language of rights to talk about private relationships as well, and the relationships between private entities with each other, the obligations that private entities have with respect to each other. So this means private individuals, but this also means businesses, private hospitals, private schools potentially have rights obligations to each other. These are typically relationships that, at least in traditional understandings, have been governed through private law, so tort law, contract law, that sort of thing. But now, more and more different constitutional actors are using constitutional language. And so this is called the horizontal effect of rights. Now, my book isn't a normative one, so it doesn't take any particular position with respect to this development in constitutionalism. Instead, my main goal is to bring a political theory lens, specifically Republican political theory, to really sharpen what does this development mean in a longer tradition of constitutionalism. There's been a lot of doctrinal analysis in legal scholarship, but not really political theoretic analysis. And so that's what the book tries to do.
And this is a fairly recent development in constitutional thought, right? It's not something that at least the American founders, for example, were thinking about as a central feature of their constitution. But as you trace it out in the book, as constitutions develop and as our legal understandings of what constitutional orders look like, these things started to change over time. Can you just give us a brief history of horizontality?
Sure, absolutely. So you're absolutely right. The American founders didn't really even contemplate this idea. The assumption was the Constitution was a contract that created obligations for the government, and that it was the government that was responsible for protecting rights primarily. Now, there's a one can flesh out the picture by drawing attention to, say, like the common law tradition, which of course does govern and has governed always private relationships. And so it wasn't so much that the American framers neglected the need to regulate private interactions. It was just the mechanisms through which they did so were not what I'm describing, were not this, horizontal understanding of constitutions. And so the first moment where you really begin to see American constitutional actors contemplating something like this is actually in the wake of the Civil War, when the American Congress had just adopted the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And we're wondering, what exactly did this allow Congress to do? What exactly did these new commitments allow Congress to do in general, but also in private spaces? And so pretty quickly after these amendments were adopted, Congress, led by the radical Republicans, passed it was the Civil Rights Act, but the first Civil Rights Act. It's not the one that we commonly talk about today. But it tried to do very much the same thing, which is, regulate, inns and theaters and these public accommodations, these privately owned spaces, to require all comers to be admitted, to be allowed. So in other words, to begin to root out these discriminatory practices in private spaces. Now, this, if allowed to pass, this could have been something like horizontal application, horizontal effect. You're taking the Constitution as a source of obligation for private actors. Granted, it's mediated through this statute, ordinary law, but in some understandings, this actually qualifies still as this horizontal effect. Now, very quickly, just a few years after this was passed, the Supreme Court said this is not acceptable, and it's because this 14th Amendment in this case wasn't supposed to bear on private spaces. So this is kind of how a vertical model, what in the United States is called the state action doctrine, because it requires state action for constitutional rights protections. That's when that was really cemented. But it's interesting to see, even in this fairly early moment in American history, some people contemplating something like horizontality. But that's a bit of a digression. Really, the first articulation of horizontal application as it's understood today was in a 1958 case, I think, in Germany, called the Lute case, when the court takes its new constitution, adopted after World War II, and really sees it as a constitution that's meant to speak to the broader polity. This wasn't just about changing the state or holding the state accountable to new commitments, although it certainly did that. This was really about shaping German society to commit to dignity, to commit to the inviolability of the human person in the wake of World War II and the Holocaust. And so it's in that decision that you see the court articulating something like a version of horizontal application. And from there, other countries began to adopt it either through court cases, or very often we're seeing constitution makers actually codify some practice of horizontal application in the constitutional texts. So I think it's safe to say that some version of this exists in every part of the world at this point.
So from a liberal perspective, liberal just kind of broadly defined, how do we square this with the kind of pluralism and general aversion to coercion that liberals have? And we have it to different degrees. Within the liberal tradition, there's disagreements about what all the contours of all of that. But in general, the appeal, and this gets us back to the beginning of the conversation, the appeal of liberalism is each of us can pursue our best life. And my best life might not look the same as your best life, but we can do it peacefully and in parallel, and versus having to have this, we don't need to be the integralists saying everyone's going to like love my Catholic theocracy or whatever it happens to be. And yet this approach to constitutional thinking seems to be saying like, we have this vision. So anti-racism or equality or whatever the kind of principles baked in that the Constitution is aiming at. And now we're going to start pushing on people to, it's not just that the state needs to act in certain ways that are in line with that, but we're going to kind of compel each of us to maximize those things or internalize those things or behave in ways as if we had internalized those things. And that seems, from like the kind of a classical liberal, like libertarian kind of perspective, that starts sounding kind of scary, because now you have, and you're doing it in a way, because it's in the Constitution, it's the courts interpreting it, you're doing it in a way that is like a handful of important people getting to make these kinds of decisions versus like, well, we as the people have through our legislature or whatever it happens to be decided on this. Now it is like the 9 justices getting to determine what the good life looks like.
Right. This is a great question. And honestly, this is kind of the line of thinking that began to lead me to this topic, even as a lowly grad student. And, I don't know, 2016, whenever I started thinking about this. And this actually brings us to my particular contribution to these conversations, which is to understand horizontal application as a Republican, as in classical Republican theory, as a Republican vein in liberal constitutionalism. So I think my argument is that in exactly the way that you're describing, Aaron, we have this kind of conventional wisdom of liberal constitutionalism, arguably premised on some distinction between the private and the public sphere. And then, you have this development of horizontalizing rights. And the way that I understand it is this actually injects a kind of Republican-esque element to this conventional understanding. Now, there are a couple of reasons why I make this argument. 2 concepts that I developed that I think, I argue, map onto concepts from Republican thought. The first is there's this new aspiration to parity across spheres. So whereas in a kind of classical liberal understanding, you have a private sphere that's somewhat insulated from public commitments, with horizontal application, the whole point is that there's now a kind of parity, or I don't want to say equivalence, that would be too strong, because if you look at horizontality decisions, courts are actually pretty sensitive to the way in which private actors are different from the state and may not be able to do everything that the state does. But there is a hope that the same principles or commitments are informing all spheres and all corners of the polity. So that parity, as I describe it, is something that I think maps onto, say, a Republican-esque understanding of the common good. When we talk about the common good in Republican thought, it's not, okay, well, only, state actors are going to pursue the common good. It's if you're a citizen living in the polity, you are committed, you are shaped by the common good, and you have the ability to further and pursue the common good. And that dovetails with my second concept that I develop in the book, which is duty. This is, I think, fairly straightforward. If you read liberal thinkers, sometimes they talk about duty, but it certainly is not emphasized to the extent that it is in Republican thought. And so by having constitutional commitments give rise and engender duties now for private actors, that, in my argument, is this kind of, again, re-injection of Republican ideas and at least a new Republican emphasis on duty. So you have these 2 features of horizontal application, which exactly in the way that you are characterizing, Aaron, this is what motivated the book. They don't really square with all of the traditional understandings of liberal constitutionalism. So that's the bulk of my book is aimed at drawing out these concepts in the context of different countries and cases. But in the conclusion, I make a suggestion, which is to say, okay, if horizontal application is Republican in the ways that I've described, then maybe there are ways that we can make it even better by making it even more Republican. And what do I mean by this? I argue that we would do well to bring more kinds of constitutional actors into these questions of how are we regulating private actors, and even how are we regulating them in constitutional terms. So in exactly the way that you described, courts tend to be at the forefront, and maybe we're uncomfortable with that because of the ways in which they're, counter-majoritarian, to use an old turn of phrase. But there's no reason why, say, to take a page from the old radical Republicans in the 1800s, Congress should be empowered to have these conversations about constitutional rights and enforcing constitutional rights. It shouldn't just be the province of the court to do this. And so this is a way in which we can take a cue from the Republican aspects of horizontality as it is practiced currently. And by bringing in these representative institutions and making it a little bit more of a political question, we can actually, number one, make it more Republican. And number two, I think, assuage the fears of liberals as you have articulated them.
You can learn more about Christina's book and her other work in the show notes. The Inner Life of Liberalism exists thanks to the generosity of our listeners. In addition to helping us keep the lights on, patrons gain access to extended cuts of interviews and exclusive bonus episodes. You can learn more about supporting us, explore previous episodes, and nerd out with me and Aaron at liberalpractice.org. We hope to see you there soon.